The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the worn canvas covering her wagon. The year was 1847, and the Oregon Trail stretched endlessly before her family like a ribbon of hope and hardship. Her husband Thomas walked alongside their oxen, his weathered hands gripping the wooden yoke as he guided the animals forward. Their 3 children sat in the back of the wagon, their faces already showing the wear of 2 months on the trail. Sarah had never imagined her life would lead to this moment. Just 6 months earlier, she had been teaching in a small schoolhouse in Missouri, her days filled with the laughter of children learning their letters and numbers. She had married Thomas, a kind blacksmith with gentle eyes and strong hands, believing they would build their life in the familiar comfort of their hometown. But the stories of free land in Oregon Territory had captured Thomas's imagination, and like thousands of other families, they had sold everything they owned to chase the promise of a better tomorrow. The wagon train consisted of 47 families, all bound together by their shared dream and the harsh reality that survival depended on cooperation. Captain William Hardy, a gruff but fair man who had made this journey 3 times before, led their group. He knew every river crossing, every mountain pass, and every danger that waited along the trail. His word was law, and his experience had kept many families alive on previous journeys. Sarah's wagon was positioned near the back of the train, a placement that often meant eating dust kicked up by the animals ahead. But she didn't complain. She had learned that complaining served no purpose on the trail, where every day brought new challenges that tested the limits of human endurance. Their supplies were carefully rationed, every pound of flour and every strip of dried meat accounted for. Water was precious, and finding good grazing for the animals often determined where they would camp each night. The children had adapted to trail life better than Sarah had expected. 10-year-old Mary helped with cooking and mending, her small fingers surprisingly skilled at patching torn clothing. 8-year-old James collected buffalo chips for fuel and kept watch for interesting rocks and animals along the way. Little Emma, only 5 years old, had developed an uncanny ability to sleep through the constant jolting and swaying of the wagon. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice other travelers on the trail. Native American tribes often approached the wagon trains, sometimes offering to trade fresh meat for tools or blankets. Captain Hardy always handled these encounters with respectful caution, knowing that maintaining peaceful relations was essential for everyone's safety. Sarah watched these interactions with growing curiosity, observing how the native families traveled with their children, how they seemed to know every detail of the land around them. One evening, as the wagon train made camp near a small stream, Sarah met a woman from the Pawnee tribe who spoke some English. The woman, who introduced herself as White Dove, had come to trade beaded moccasins for sugar. As they completed their exchange, White Dove's eyes lingered on Sarah's children, particularly little Emma, who was playing nearby with a cornhusk doll. Through broken English and gestures, White Dove told Sarah about her own children, 3 young ones who lived with her tribe during the summer months. She spoke of how her people taught their children to read the signs of nature, to find food and medicine in plants that looked like weeds to untrained eyes. Sarah found herself drawn into conversation with this woman, who seemed so different yet so familiar in her love for her children. The friendship that began that evening would grow stronger over the following weeks. White Dove's band was traveling in the same general direction as the wagon train, and their paths crossed several times. Each meeting brought new exchanges of knowledge and goods. Sarah learned to identify edible plants and to read weather signs and cloud formations. White Dove became fascinated by Sarah's books and asked her to explain the marks on paper that contained stories and information. As summer progressed into early autumn, the wagon train faced increasing hardships. River crossings became more dangerous as water levels dropped and banks became muddy. Several families lost precious belongings when wagons overturned or oxen became mired in quicksand like mud. Disease struck the train, claiming 2 elderly members and leaving several children weakened by fever. Sarah used her teaching skills to help care for the sick, reading to them from her precious Bible and sharing the limited medical knowledge she possessed. The relationship between the wagon train and White Dove's band provided unexpected benefits for both groups. When the travelers' cattle strayed during a thunderstorm, native scouts helped locate the animals before they could be lost forever. In return, the settlers shared their metal tools and helped repair damaged travois. Captain Hardy, initially suspicious of too much contact with the natives, began to see the value of these peaceful exchanges. Sarah's own perspective was changing daily. The woman who had started this journey focused primarily on reaching Oregon, now found herself deeply connected to the land they traveled through and the people who had called it home for generations. She began to see the trail not as a path through wilderness, but as a route through a complex landscape filled with history, culture, and wisdom she had never imagined. Late one September afternoon, as the wagon train struggled up a particularly steep incline, Sarah noticed that White Dove's band had not appeared for their usual evening visit. Thomas mentioned that Captain Hardy seemed concerned about reports of conflict further ahead on the trail. Other tribes, less friendly to white settlers, were said to be gathering in the mountains they would soon enter. That night, as Sarah tucked her children into their bedrolls, she felt a growing sense of unease. The prairie wind carried unfamiliar sounds, and even the seasoned trail hands seemed more alert than usual. She lay awake listening to the night sounds, thinking about White Dove and her children, wondering what lay ahead for all of them in the vast wilderness that still stretched between their current position and the promised land of Oregon Territory. The attack came at dawn when most of the wagon train was still preparing for the day's journey. Sarah was rekindling their cooking fire when the first war cries echoed across the camp. Within seconds, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos as mounted warriors swept down from the surrounding hills. These were not White Dove's people, but members of a hostile band who saw the wagon train as an invasion of their territory. Captain Hardy's voice boomed over the noise, shouting orders for the wagons to form a defensive circle. Thomas grabbed his rifle and pushed Sarah and the children toward their wagon, his face grim with determination. The next hour became a blur of gunfire, screaming, and the thunder of horses' hooves. Sarah crouched in the wagon bed with her children pressed against her, trying to shield them from the violence exploding around them. When the attack finally ended, the cost was devastating. 7 settlers lay dead, including Captain Hardy, whose leadership they desperately needed. 12 others bore serious wounds that would slow their progress significantly. Most of their livestock had been driven off, leaving only enough oxen to pull about half the wagons. The remaining families faced an impossible choice: abandon their possessions or face almost certain death in the wilderness. The decision was made to consolidate. Families would take only their most essential belongings and crowd into the remaining functional wagons. Sarah's wagon was damaged but still serviceable, so 3 additional families joined them, creating cramped conditions that tested everyone's patience. Thomas took on the role of scout, his blacksmith strength making him valuable for the heavy work of clearing obstacles and repairing equipment. For 2 weeks, the reduced wagon train struggled forward, making poor time across increasingly difficult terrain. Food ran low, and the wounded grew weaker without proper medical care. Morale plummeted as families argued over resources and questioned decisions made by their new leaders. Sarah found herself mediating disputes and caring for sick children whose parents were too exhausted to cope. Then, on a cold October morning, White Dove appeared at the edge of their camp. She came alone on foot, her face bearing news that chilled Sarah's heart. White Dove's band had encountered the hostile warriors who had attacked the wagon train. In the fighting that followed, several of her people had been killed, including her husband. Worse still, the enemy band had taken captives 3 children from White Dove's tribe, including her youngest daughter, a girl barely older than Emma. Through tears and broken English, White Dove explained that the hostile band was holding the children at a camp deep in the mountains, planning to trade them to other tribes or kill them if they became burdensome. The captors were led by a warrior called Black Wolf, known for his hatred of white settlers and his cruelty toward anyone who associated with them. White Dove's attempts to negotiate for the children's release had been met with violence and threats. Sarah felt her heart break as she watched this mother's anguish. She thought of her own children and could barely imagine the pain of having one stolen away. Without hesitation, she invited White Dove to travel with their wagon train, offering what comfort and protection they could provide. But White Dove shook her head, explaining that she could not abandon the other captive children even if it meant risking her own life. The wagon train was in no position to mount a rescue mission. They had fewer than 20 able-bodied men, limited ammunition, and wounded people who could not be left undefended. Their own survival depended on reaching a trading post still many days ahead, where they could resupply and get help for their injured. The practical choice was to continue their journey and hope that White Dove could somehow find another way to save the children. But Sarah could not accept this practical choice. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, she made a decision that would change everything. She quietly gathered supplies from their wagon: blankets, dried meat, her small store of medicine, and most importantly, the materials needed to start a large fire. She also took her most precious possession, a small wooden box containing her mother's jewelry and the few pieces of silver they had brought from Missouri. Before dawn, she slipped away from the camp with White Dove, leaving a note for Thomas explaining her choice. She could not abandon children in danger, even if those children were not her own. The note told Thomas to continue with the wagon train, to take their children to safety in Oregon, and to understand that some choices had to be made with the heart rather than the head. The two women traveled on foot toward the mountains, following trails that White Dove knew from childhood. They moved carefully, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted by scouts from Black Wolf's band. White Dove taught Sarah to read the landscape for signs of recent passage, to find water in unlikely places, and to move silently through thick brush. Sarah's teaching skills proved valuable as she helped White Dove improve her English, creating a shared vocabulary that would be crucial in the dangerous days ahead. On their third day of travel, they reached a high ridge that overlooked the valley where the hostile band had made their camp. Through careful observation, they could see the captive children, 3 small figures sitting near a large fire under constant guard. White Dove pointed out her daughter, a girl with braided hair who sat apart from the others, her small body radiating defiance even from a distance. The camp was well positioned for defense. Situated in a narrow valley with high walls that made approach difficult, more than 30 warriors lived there, along with their families. Getting close enough to rescue the children seemed impossible. But Sarah had begun forming a plan based on something Captain Hardy had once told her about using fire as a signal for help. That night, as they made their own small camp in a hidden cave, Sarah explained her idea to White Dove. It was desperate and dangerous, requiring them to split up and take enormous risks. But it might be their only chance to save the children before Black Wolf's band moved deeper into the mountains, where rescue would become truly impossible. White Dove listened carefully, asking questions about details and timing. Despite the danger, she agreed to the plan. They both understood that failure would likely mean death for all of them, including the children they were trying to save. But the alternative was to abandon innocent children to an uncertain fate, and neither woman could live with that choice. Sarah's plan required careful timing and tremendous courage from both women. She would create a massive signal fire on the highest peak overlooking the valley, using her wagon's canvas and wooden parts as fuel. The fire would be visible for miles and would hopefully attract help from any friendly forces in the area, including cavalry patrols or other wagon trains. Meanwhile, White Dove would position herself closer to the enemy camp, ready to act when the distraction created an opportunity. The next morning, Sarah began the difficult task of hauling materials up the steep mountain slope. She had taken apart the remaining pieces of her damaged wagon during the night, creating bundles of wood and canvas that she could carry. The climb was exhausting, made more difficult by the need to remain hidden from any scouts who might be watching the surrounding hills. As she climbed, Sarah thought about the children she had left with the wagon train. She prayed that Thomas would keep them safe and that they would understand why she had made this choice. She thought about her comfortable life back in Missouri, how simple her problems had seemed then compared to the life and death decisions she now faced daily. The trail had changed her in ways she was still discovering. Reaching the peak took most of the day. By late afternoon, Sarah had assembled a substantial pile of combustible materials on the highest point of the mountain. She carefully arranged the wood and canvas to create maximum flame and smoke, adding dried grass and pine needles to help the fire spread quickly. She had also brought along a small amount of gunpowder taken from Thomas's supplies, which would create a bright flash when the fire started. As the sun began to set, Sarah watched the valley below through her husband's spyglass. The enemy camp showed normal evening activity, with cooking fires being lit and warriors returning from hunting or scouting missions. She could see the 3 captive children sitting near the main fire, still under heavy guard. White Dove was positioned somewhere in the rocks below, invisible but ready to move when the moment came. At full darkness, Sarah lit her signal fire. The flames leaped skyward immediately, fed by the dry wood and canvas. The gunpowder created a brilliant flash that could be seen for miles. followed by a column of fire and smoke that illuminated the entire mountainside. Sarah fed the fire continuously, adding material to keep it burning as brightly as possible throughout the night. The effect in the valley below was immediate and dramatic. The enemy camp erupted into activity as warriors grabbed weapons and prepared for possible attack. Sarah could see them pointing at her fire and sending scouts in different directions to investigate. Most importantly, she could see that the guards around the children had been reduced as men were sent to deal with this potential threat. White Dove made her move just after midnight, when the camp's attention was focused on the mysterious fire above them. Using skills learned from childhood, she crept through the darkness toward the area where the children were being held. Sarah watched through the spyglass, her heart pounding as she saw White Dove's shadowy figure moving between the rocks and scattered shelters. The rescue almost succeeded completely. White Dove reached the children and managed to free 2 of them, including her own daughter. But as they attempted to escape, one of the boys stumbled and cried out in fear. The sound alerted the remaining guards, and within moments the camp was in full pursuit. Sarah watched in horror as warriors mounted their horses and began chasing the fleeing figures across the valley floor. White Dove made a heartbreaking decision. To give the 2 children she had freed a better chance of escape, she turned to face their pursuers, drawing the warriors' attention to herself. She fought with desperate courage, using a knife and her knowledge of the terrain to hold off multiple attackers. But she was eventually overwhelmed and taken captive along with the 3rd child, a boy who had been too frightened to run when the opportunity came. Sarah's signal fire had been burning for hours, creating a beacon visible for many miles in every direction. As dawn approached, she was exhausted from feeding the flames and sick with worry about White Dove's fate. Then she heard something that made her heart leap with hope: the sound of horses approaching from the east. A cavalry patrol, investigating the strange fire, had ridden through the night to reach the source of the signal. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison led a force of 24 soldiers who had been searching for the wagon train after receiving reports of the attack. The massive fire had guided them directly to Sarah's position, and she quickly explained the situation in the valley below. Morrison was an experienced frontier officer who understood both the danger and the opportunity presented by the current situation. The soldiers could see the enemy camp in the valley below, now clearly visible in the morning light. Morrison counted the warriors and assessed their defensive position, while Sarah described the captives being held. The officer faced a difficult decision. His primary mission was to locate and assist the surviving wagon train members, but he could not ignore the plight of the captive children and White Dove. Morrison decided to attempt a rescue mission, but he needed more information about the enemy's strength and the exact location of the prisoners. Sarah volunteered to act as a scout, using her knowledge of the camp's layout and her ability to identify the specific individuals who needed to be rescued. Against his better judgment, the lieutenant colonel agreed to let her guide a small reconnaissance team closer to the enemy position. The scouting mission revealed that Black Wolf's band was preparing to move deeper into the mountains, taking their captives with them. This information forced Morrison to act quickly, before the enemy could retreat to a position where rescue would be impossible. He divided his force, sending half the soldiers to circle around the valley while the other half prepared for a direct assault. Sarah insisted on remaining with the assault team, arguing that she was the only one who could definitively identify the captive children in the chaos of battle. Morrison reluctantly agreed, but assigned 2 soldiers to protect her during the fighting. As they prepared for the attack, Sarah thought about how far she had come from her quiet life as a schoolteacher. She was about to participate in a military assault on an enemy camp, risking her life for children she barely knew. The attack began at dawn, with soldiers advancing from multiple directions, while Sarah's signal fire continued to burn on the mountainside above. The battle would determine not only the fate of the captive children, but also whether Sarah's desperate gamble would save lives or lead to even greater tragedy. The battle for the valley began with the thunder of cavalry charges echoing off the canyon walls. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's soldiers attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, creating confusion in Black Wolf's camp and preventing the warriors from organizing an effective defense. Sarah watched from a protected position as uniformed soldiers clashed with mounted warriors in fierce hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Black Wolf proved to be a formidable opponent, rallying his warriors with fierce war cries and leading counterattacks that pushed the soldiers back toward the valley entrance. For a terrifying hour, the outcome remained uncertain as both sides fought desperately for control of the camp. Sarah could see the captive children huddled near a large boulder, guarded by two warriors who seemed prepared to kill their prisoners rather than let them be rescued. The turning point came when Sergeant O'Malley, a veteran Irish soldier with 20 years of frontier experience, managed to work his way around behind the enemy position. His well-placed rifle shots eliminated the guards threatening the children, allowing Sarah and two soldiers to reach the captives during the confusion. White Dove lay nearby, badly wounded but still alive, her eyes lighting up when she saw her daughter running toward her. As Sarah gathered the frightened children, she realized that the battle was far from over. Black Wolf had regrouped his remaining warriors and was mounting a final desperate assault on the soldiers' position. The warrior leader had recognized that his defeat was likely, but he was determined to take as many enemies with him as possible. Sarah found herself trapped in the middle of the fighting with three terrified children and a wounded woman who could barely stand. The rescue became a nightmare of its own as Sarah tried to move the children to safety while bullets and arrows flew around them. The youngest child, White Dove's daughter, was too frightened to move, clinging to her wounded mother and crying in a language Sarah didn't understand. The two boys, though older, were weakened by their captivity and struggled to keep up as Sarah led them toward the soldiers' defensive position. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had anticipated this difficulty and had prepared an escape route along the stream that ran through the valley floor. Sarah half-carried, half-dragged White Dove while the children followed close behind, staying low to avoid the crossfire above them. The stream bed provided some protection from the battle, but they were still exposed to warriors who had positioned themselves on the high ground. One of Black Wolf's warriors spotted their escape attempt and rode down from the hillside, determined to recapture the prisoners or kill them before they could reach safety. Sarah found herself face-to-face with an armed enemy while protecting three children and a wounded woman. With no weapon except a cooking knife from her supplies, she stood between the warrior and the children, prepared to fight to the death if necessary. The confrontation lasted only seconds but felt like hours. The warrior raised his war club, clearly intending to strike down this woman who had dared to interfere with his tribe's captives. Sarah closed her eyes and braced for the blow, thinking of her own children and hoping they would understand why she had made this choice. The killing blow never came. Sergeant O'Malley's rifle shot dropped the warrior from his horse just as he was about to attack. The Irish soldier appeared from behind a boulder, reloading his weapon while scanning for other threats. He helped Sarah lift White Dove and urged them all to move faster toward the safety of the main force's position. Behind them, the battle was reaching its climax as Black Wolf made his final stand. When they finally reached the soldiers' defensive position, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and emotion. The children clung to White Dove, who despite her wounds had found the strength to comfort them in their own language. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's men had gained control of the camp, but the cost had been high. 4 soldiers lay dead, and several others carried wounds that would trouble them for life. Black Wolf himself had died fighting, refusing to surrender even when his defeat became certain. His followers who survived the battle were allowed to leave the valley, taking their families and possessions with them. Morrison understood that showing mercy to the defeated warriors might prevent future conflicts with other tribal bands in the region. The immediate crisis was over, but Sarah now faced the challenge of getting White Dove and the children to safety. The wounded woman needed medical care that was beyond anything available in the wilderness. The children, though physically unharmed, showed the emotional scars of their captivity and the violence they had witnessed. Sarah found herself responsible for their welfare in a harsh environment where survival was never guaranteed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison offered to escort the entire group back to the nearest military post, but that would mean a journey of several weeks through dangerous territory. White Dove, despite her injuries, insisted that she and the children should return to what remained of her tribe rather than depend on the army's protection. She feared that staying too long with white soldiers might make her people unwelcome to other tribal bands who were suspicious of anyone who associated with the military. Sarah faced another agonizing decision. She could return to the safety of the military post and eventually rejoin Thomas and her own children with the wagon train. Or she could help White Dove and the rescued children make their way back to their people, a journey that would expose her to even greater dangers and delay her reunion with her own family for months. The decision was made easier when one of the rescued children, the boy who had been too frightened to escape during White Dove's first rescue attempt, became seriously ill. The trauma of captivity combined with exposure and poor food had weakened his resistance to disease. He developed a high fever and could not keep food down, symptoms that Sarah recognized from her experience caring for sick members of the wagon train. Without proper medical care, the boy would likely die within days. The nearest doctor was at Fort Collins, a military post more than a week's journey away through territory that might still harbor hostile warriors seeking revenge for Black Wolf's defeat. White Dove was too injured to make such a difficult journey quickly, and the other children were too young to help care for their sick companion. Sarah made her choice with full knowledge of what it would cost her. She would stay with White Dove and the children, helping them reach safety even if it meant sacrificing her own chance to rejoin her family quickly. She wrote another letter to Thomas, giving it to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison to deliver when he found the wagon train. In it, she explained her decision and expressed her love for her husband and children, while asking them to understand that she could not abandon children in need. The journey with White Dove and the children became a test of endurance that pushed Sarah beyond limits she never knew she possessed. They traveled slowly, caring for the sick boy while avoiding areas where hostile warriors might be seeking revenge for their defeat. White Dove's knowledge of the land proved invaluable, as she guided them along hidden trails and to water sources that would have been impossible for Sarah to find alone. The sick child, whose name Sarah learned was Running Bear, required constant attention. His fever raged for days, and he could barely keep down the thin broths that Sarah prepared from roots and herbs that White Dove showed her how to gather. Sarah spent sleepless nights cooling his burning forehead with wet cloths and trying to get small amounts of liquid into his dehydrated body. The other two children, White Dove's daughter Little Hawk and a boy called Standing Wolf, helped as much as they could while dealing with their own trauma from captivity. White Dove's wounds were healing slowly, but the deeper injury was to her spirit. She had lost her husband in the fighting with Black Wolf's band, and the responsibility of caring for 3 children while wounded and far from her people weighed heavily on her heart. Sarah watched this proud woman struggle with grief while maintaining the strength needed to guide them through dangerous territory. The bond between the two mothers deepened as they shared the burden of protecting the children. After 10 days of difficult travel, they encountered a group of Pawnee scouts who recognized White Dove and brought news from her tribe. The remaining members of her band had moved north toward their winter camping grounds, hoping to avoid further conflict with hostile groups. The scouts offered to guide White Dove and the children to safety, but they were reluctant to help Sarah, viewing her as a potential source of trouble for their people. White Dove spoke passionately to the scouts in her own language, gesturing towards Sarah and the children. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she could hear the emotion in White Dove's voice as she described what had happened and how Sarah had risked everything to help rescue the captives. The discussion continued for hours, with the scouts clearly torn between their desire to help their people and their fear of the consequences of assisting a white woman. The debate was settled when Running Bear took a turn for the worse. His fever spiked dangerously high, and he began having convulsions that terrified everyone watching. Sarah worked frantically to cool his body and keep him breathing, using every bit of medical knowledge she possessed. White Dove held the boy while chanting prayers in her native language, calling on her ancestors to help save this innocent child's life. One of the Pawnee scouts, an older man called Gray Eagle, had experience with healing and recognized that the boy needed more help than they could provide in the wilderness. He knew of a trading post where a French doctor sometimes stayed during his travels through the territory. Getting there would require 2 more days of hard travel, but it might be Running Bear's only chance for survival. Sarah made the difficult decision to separate from White Dove and the other children temporarily. She would take Running Bear to the trading post while White Dove and the others continued toward their people's winter camp with the Pawnee scouts. If the boy survived, Sarah would bring him to rejoin White Dove later. If he died, at least she would have tried everything possible to save him. The journey to the trading post became a race against time. Gray Eagle led Sarah and Running Bear through country she had never seen before, following paths that seemed invisible to her untrained eyes. The old scout pushed their small party hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest their horses or check on the boy's condition. Sarah rode while holding Running Bear in her arms, feeling his life ebbing away with each mile they traveled. They reached Benton's trading post, just as Sarah feared they were too late. Running Bear had stopped responding to her voice and his. Breathing had become so shallow she could barely detect it. The trading post was a rough collection of log buildings surrounded by a wooden fence, designed to serve trappers, traders, and travelers passing through the remote territory. Sarah had never been so happy to see civilization, even in such a crude form. Dr. Pierre Beaumont was indeed at the trading post, recovering from a bout of malaria that had struck him during his travels. The French physician was a small, energetic man who had spent years treating everything from gunshot wounds to exotic diseases in the frontier territories. He took one look at Running Bear and immediately began working to save the boy's life, sending Sarah to help gather supplies while he examined his patient. The next 48 hours tested everyone's endurance. Dr. Beaumont worked tirelessly to break Running Bear's fever and restore his strength, using medicines he had brought from St. Louis along with remedies he had learned from various tribal healers. Sarah assisted him, learning techniques she had never imagined and seeing medical practices that differed greatly from anything she had known back in Missouri. Running Bear's recovery was slow, but steady. The fever finally broke on the third day, and the boy began to recognize Sarah and respond to her voice. Dr. Beaumont explained that the child had been suffering from a combination of malnutrition, exposure, and what he suspected was a form of typhus contracted during his captivity. Without prompt medical treatment, the boy would certainly have died within days. As Running Bear grew stronger, Sarah learned more about his background from Dr. Beaumont, who spoke several native languages and could communicate with the boy. Running Bear was actually from a different tribe than White Dove's people, having been captured during an earlier raid and traded to Black Wolf's band. His own family lived far to the south, and he had been trying to escape and return to them when Sarah and White Dove found him. This revelation created a new dilemma for Sarah. She had promised to reunite Running Bear with White Dove and the other children, but the boy's own family was hundreds of miles away in the opposite direction. Dr. Beaumont offered to help locate Running Bear's tribe during his future travels, but that could take months or even years. Meanwhile, White Dove and the others would be wondering what had happened to them. Sarah decided to keep her promise to White Dove first. Once Running Bear was strong enough to travel, they would rejoin White Dove's group and then work together to find a way to return the boy to his own people. Gray Eagle had agreed to wait at the trading post until Sarah was ready to continue their journey, though he was clearly anxious to return to his own duties with the Pawnee Scouts. The decision proved wise when a message arrived at the trading post that changed everything. A cavalry patrol brought word that Thomas and the remaining wagon train members had safely reached Fort Collins. More importantly, Thomas had convinced the military authorities to organize a search expedition to find Sarah. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had delivered Sarah's letter explaining her decision to help White Dove, and Thomas was preparing to join the search party himself. Dr. Beaumont offered to carry a message back to Fort Collins, letting Thomas know that Sarah was alive and would be returning as soon as she could safely do so. Sarah wrote another letter to her husband and children, describing her experiences and expressing her love while explaining why she needed to complete her mission to help the native children reach safety. She promised to return to them as soon as possible, though she couldn't predict when that might be. The reunion with White Dove and the other children took place at a sacred site near the Platte River, where the Pawnee had established their winter camp. Sarah arrived with Running Bear just as the first snows began falling, marking the end of the traveling season and the beginning of a harsh winter that would test everyone's survival skills. White Dove wept with joy when she saw that both Sarah and Running Bear had survived their dangerous journey to the trading post. The Pawnee elders had spent weeks debating what to do about Sarah's presence in their camp. Some viewed her as a friend who had risked everything to save their children, while others worried that harboring a white woman would bring trouble from both military forces and hostile tribes. The decision was finally made to allow Sarah to stay through the winter, partly because the weather made travel impossible, and partly because her medical knowledge had already proven valuable in treating sick members of the tribe. Sarah found herself living in a world completely different from anything she had experienced. The Pawnee Winter Camp was a complex community with its own laws, customs, and social structure. She learned to help with daily tasks like preparing food, making clothing, and maintaining the shelters that would protect them through the long, cold months ahead. White Dove became her teacher and protector, helping her understand the unwritten rules that govern tribal life. The language barrier created constant challenges, but Sarah's teaching experience helped her learn basic Pawnee words and phrases quickly. She discovered that many concepts she took for granted had no direct translation, while the Pawnee had dozens of words for things she had never noticed. The children became her best teachers, patiently correcting her pronunciation and laughing at her mistakes without malice. Running Bear's presence in the camp created its own complications. As his health improved, he began talking about his desire to return to his own people far to the south. The Pawnee understood his feelings but couldn't spare warriors for such a dangerous journey during winter. They also worried that sending him away might seem like rejection to other tribes who had lost children to raiders. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of these complex tribal politics. Winter in the camp brought both hardships and unexpected pleasures. Sarah had never experienced such cold, but she also discovered the warmth of a community that shared everything and looked after each member's welfare. She learned to make warm clothing from buffalo hides, to find food in the frozen landscape, and to tell stories around the fire during the long winter nights. Her own stories of life back in Missouri fascinated the Pawnee, who were curious about the strange customs of white settlers. The relationship between Sarah and White Dove deepened into something approaching sisterhood. Despite their different backgrounds, both women understood the universal experiences of motherhood, loss, and the fierce love that drives people to risk everything for their children. White Dove shared stories of her husband and their dreams for their daughter's future, while Sarah spoke of Thomas and her own children waiting for her return. As winter progressed, Sarah's medical skills became increasingly important to the camp's survival. She treated everything from broken bones to difficult births, combining her limited knowledge with remedies that White Dove and the tribal healers taught her. When an outbreak of influenza threatened the camp, Sarah worked tirelessly alongside the Pawnee medicine men to save lives, earning the respect of even the most suspicious tribal members. Spring's arrival brought new challenges and opportunities. Messengers from other tribes brought news of the wider world, including reports that military patrols were actively searching for Sarah. Thomas had apparently convinced the authorities that his wife was not a willing captive but a hero who had risked her life to save children. The army wanted to find her and reunite her with her family, but they also needed to be careful not to appear as if they were invading Pawnee territory. The tribal council met repeatedly to decide Sarah's fate. Some members wanted to escort her back to white settlements before military forces arrived in their territory. Others believed she should stay with them permanently, as her skills had proven valuable, and her loyalty to their children had been demonstrated beyond question. Sarah herself was torn between her desire to return to her own family and her commitment to helping Running Bear find his way home. The solution came from an unexpected source. A mixed-blood trader named Henri Dubois arrived at the camp with news that Running Bear's tribe had been asking questions about their missing boy throughout the trading network. Dubois offered to take both Sarah and Running Bear south during his regular trading journey, reuniting the boy with his family while helping Sarah begin her own journey back to her husband and children. White Dove made the painful decision to let her adopted son go with Sarah and Dubois. She knew that Running Bear would never be truly happy until he was back with his own people, and she trusted Sarah to ensure the boy's safety during the journey. The decision meant another separation and more uncertainty, but it was the right choice for everyone involved. The farewell from the Pawnee camp was emotional for everyone. Sarah had spent months living as part of their community, sharing their hardships and contributing to their survival. She had learned to see the world through different eyes and had gained a deep respect for people her former neighbors would have called savages. The children she had helped rescue gave her small gifts to remember them by, while the adults offered their blessings for her journey home. The journey south with Henri Dubois and Running Bear took 6 weeks, following trading routes that connected dozens of tribal communities across the Great Plains. Sarah saw more of the vast Western territory than most white settlers ever would. Observing how different tribes adapted to their environments, and maintained complex relationships with each other. Running Bear grew stronger and more excited with each mile that brought him closer to home. The reunion between Running Bear and his family was joyful beyond description. His parents had mourned him as dead for more than a year, and his siblings had grown so much that he barely recognized them. Sarah stayed long enough to see him safely settled with his people, knowing that her mission to protect the captive children was finally complete. The boy's father offered her gifts and honors that she politely declined, asking only for guides who could help her begin the long journey back to her own family. Sarah's return to Fort Collins took another month of difficult travel, but she was sustained by the knowledge that Thomas and her children were waiting for her there. She had changed dramatically during her months in the wilderness, gaining skills and perspectives that would stay with her for life. She had also proven to herself that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort and compassion over convenience. The reunion with Thomas and her children was everything Sarah had dreamed of during her long absence. They had all changed during their separation, but their love had remained constant. Thomas had established a small farm near the fort while waiting for her return, and he listened with amazement as Sarah told him about her adventures and the people who had become part of her extended family. Sarah never forgot White Dove and the lessons she had learned during her time with the Pawnee. She maintained correspondence with Dr. Beaumont, who brought her news of her adopted tribal family during his travels. Years later, when her own children were grown, Sarah would tell them stories of courage and friendship that crossed cultural boundaries, teaching them that heroism often required sacrificing personal comfort for the welfare of others who needed help.